Hi, thank you. So, my own political history, really, in relation to anti-Semitism, begins in the 1980s. I was a student activist. I was part of a whole kind of Trotskyist far-left milieu. And what happened in the early 80s was that there was an attempt to prohibit, to ban Jewish societies in colleges in the UK, like the equivalent of Hillels, to ban them on the basis that they were Zionist and therefore racist. And so, in a sense, I cut my teeth on these discussions in the far left in the UK right back in the 80s. And at that time, there was always kind of ultra anti-Zionism on the left, and there were always ways in which it crossed over and related to anti-Semitism, but it was always isolated. It was a kind of weird Stalinist corner of the left where this debate happened, which happily I was part of at that time. So, jump forward 20 years or a little less. So I grew up a bit, I had kids, I got a proper job, and I'm in university, a PhD, all that stuff. I'm in a university, and some of these same people are popping up again trying to boycott Israel. In my trade union, there's a call for a boycott of Israeli academics. So we got involved in this, which was, politically a very similar fight, and we lost. We couldn't have lost worse. We fought for 3 or 4 years in the union. It was really quite a difficult experience, and we lost. There was no resonance for the arguments about the relationships between boycott and anti-Semitism, and there was simply a kind of common sense view emerged that boycotting Israel was entirely reasonable. At that time, one of the reasons I took this seriously, and actually right back in the 80s, one of the reasons I took this seriously is because I thought that there was always a danger of this kind of politics mainstreaming. So in the 80s, it was in a very little corner of the far left. In 2005-06, it entered my trade union, the trade union of the academics, and it had a rather big success. And not this year, last year, 2015, this kind of politics really went into the mainstream of the British left. This is Malia Bouattia, who won the presidency of the National Union of Students. So it wasn't just a little corner of the left or the student movement, but she won the presidency. She's somebody who condemns the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians as strengthening the colonial project, and she's somebody who counterposes supporting what she calls the resistance of the Palestinians to the peace process. And she says things about, for example, mainstream Zionist-led media outlets and that kind of rhetoric. So she's the president of the NUS, National Union of Students. This is Len McCluskey. He's the General Secretary of the Unite Union. As I said, this was always around. Now it's in charge, or now it's taken leadership. Len McCluskey talks about the row over anti-Semitism within the Labour Party as nothing more than a cynical attempt to challenge Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. In other words, the people who raise the issue of anti-Semitism are doing it cynically, not believing it, in order to smear the left. I'll say more about that later. So this is Jeremy Corbyn, who's now the leader of the Labour Party. Corbyn has been around as a member of Parliament for, 30 years, maybe more. I kind of vaguely knew him. I debated him at one time on whether Israel was apartheid. And he sat with Ben White, who's the guy who wrote one of the books about Israeli apartheid. And he advocated for boycott and for treating Israel as a pariah state. I'm just wondering if I should. This is a transcript of a video, actually. I won't go into it in detail because it will take too much time, I think. So let me just read a little bit of it. Tomorrow evening it will be my pleasure, said Jeremy Corbyn at a meeting in Parliament, my pleasure and my honour to host an event in Parliament where our friends from Hezbollah will be speaking. I'd also invited friends from Hamas to come and speak as well. Now, this became an issue later when Corbyn stood for the leadership, and people asked him, do you consider Hamas and Hezbollah, these anti-Semitic movements, as your friends? And Jeremy Corbyn always said, well, no, that's not what was going on. He said, I support the peace process. It was diplomatic language. I'm in favour of discussion. And if you're in favour of discussion, then you address people in a kind of friendly way, and that's all it was. What people didn't do in challenging him was to carry on and look at the rest of the quote. He said, unfortunately, the Israelis would not allow them to travel here as well, so it's only going to be friends from Hezbollah. So far as I'm concerned, that is absolutely the right function of using parliamentary facilities to invite people from other parts of the world so that we can promote that peace, that understanding and that dialogue. And the idea that an organisation that is dedicated towards the good of the Palestinian people and bringing about long-term peace and social justice, he's talking about Hamas and Hezbollah, bringing about long-term peace and social justice and political justice in the whole region. Hezbollah is the outfit which for the last 2 or 3 years has been allied with Bashar al-Assad in Syria in fighting and killing very, very many people in places like Aleppo. So Jeremy Corbyn, when he claimed that friends was just a kind of diplomatic language, wasn't really telling the truth. The truth was that he had a political commitment to organisations such as Hamas and Hezbollah. This character, Raad Salah, was a Palestinian leader who had been convicted in Israel of using blood libel rhetoric. I mean, openly medieval-style blood libel rhetoric. This was what he said. We have never allowed ourselves to knead the dough for the bread that breaks the fast in the holy month of Ramadan with children's blood, he said. Whoever wants a more thorough explanation, let him ask what used to happen to some children in Europe whose blood was mixed with the dough of the holy bread. So this is a man who mobilised medieval blood libel in his anger against Israelis. And Jeremy Corbyn said, no, there's a quote, Salah is far from a dangerous man, said Jeremy Corbyn. And Jeremy Corbyn invited him to tea on the terrace of the House of Commons outside, along the river, and said, I hope everything's good for my friend Raad Salah. Stephen Sizer was a Church of England vicar who had for many years been involved in the same kind of sort of anti-Zionist politics. For example, talking about the people in the shadows as the kind of conspiratorial way of talking about people who oppose BDS. Finally, a couple of years ago, when he shared an item on Facebook which said 9/11, Israel did it, finally his church moved against him and made him shut up, really. The interesting thing in relation to Jeremy Corbyn is that he had written a letter to the church, not after the 9/11 comment, but after a whole load of previous comments. And Jeremy Corbyn pleaded for Stephen Sizer, saying that he's a victim of a smear by the Israel lobby. Corbyn speaks on Putin's propaganda channel. He speaks on Press TV, who paid him a lot of money, the Iranian propaganda channel. His response to the terrorist attacks in London were, quote, we have to recognise that the security of this country is at risk. It's at risk because of the ways in which we inflict insecurity on so many people around the world. So, again, a view of the world which has the United States and Europe, the so-called imperialist countries, being the real bad guys on the planet. They create a system of modernist, rational oppression and imperialism which causes killing and death and alienation to people all over the planet. And people like Hamas and Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda are conceived of as being resistant to that global system of imperialism. They may not be people that we like, I think Jeremy Corbyn would say, but we have to understand that this is the form that the resistance takes. So really what I've been thinking about and trying to work out for some time is, what is this thing which people have called a new anti-Semitism? And actually there's a moment, it's not the moment it started, but there's a moment which crystallizes it in a sense. I don't know if people know about the Durban World Conference Against Racism in 2001, which was a huge event in the new South Africa, the newly democratic South Africa, in which there was a big effort to construct, now that apartheid was defeated, there was a huge effort to construct Zionism as the key form of racist oppression on the planet. So kind of abstracting from every actual struggle over race or ethnicity anywhere in the world, Zionism was constructed as the key problem. And it was a huge conference. It was both an intergovernmental conference and also an NGO conference. It was held in a cricket ground. There were 20, 30,000 people around. And there was a poisonous atmosphere centering on Zionism as the key issue in the global discussion of racism. At the end of that week, there was 9/11. And at the end of that year, there was what appeared to be, anyway, for the moment, the end of the peace process in Israel and Palestine and the beginning of the Second Intifada. So it's a moment that I think symbolizes really what people have called the new anti-Semitism. This is John Molyneux, he was a fairly big kind of theoretical guy of the biggest far left party in Britain. And it's a really interesting quote, I think. An illiterate, conservative, superstitious Muslim Palestinian peasant who supports Hamas is more progressive, he says, than an educated, liberal, atheist Israeli who supports Zionism, even critically. Educated, liberal, atheist Israeli whose critical support of Zionism is less progressive than a Palestinian peasant who supports Hamas. So it's an interesting way of constructing the progressive. And it's a way which excludes the liberal Zionist Israeli from the community of the progressive. It's also a way which is careless, to say the least, about the notion that what we do and what we say and what we think is important. It's a kind of objectification of politics. So it's who you are which is important, and your position in this global system of imperialism and capitalism which is important, not actually what you believe or what you do. And I think that's kind of important, and I think it's rather threatening. This is Seamus Milne, who at the time he wrote this was a columnist in The Guardian, which is the big mainstream liberal paper, sort of the New York Times. And he wrote something kind of similar. He said, Hamas and the support it attracts is only the current expression of a spirit of Palestinian national resistance to oppression and dispossession going back decades. So for Seamus, the key thing about Hamas is, he posits this kind of mythical Palestinian national resistance, which endures and is manifested in this politics or that politics at any particular time, and actually it doesn't really matter. And if the politics that it happens to be manifested in at any particular time is a politics that we might not like, that's okay, because we've got Seamus to translate for us. So Hamas says, you know, they don't like Jews. I mean, again, Hamas is complicated and we could have a whole discussion, but one element of what Hamas does, the charter that it was founded by, says we're an anti-Semitic party, we don't like Jews, we blame them. And Seamus says what they really mean. People who voted for Hamas, they think they meant that, but what they really mean is that they want to fight imperialism and they want a peaceful Palestinian state, whatever, alongside Israel or in peace with Israel. So it's a kind of effort of constructing, interpreting what the oppressed really think when they say things that we don't like. This is Moïse Postone. Anti-Semitism can appear to be anti-hegemonic. This is the reason why a century ago August Bebel characterized it as the socialism of fools, given its subsequent development, it could also have been called the anti-imperialism of fools. As a fetishized form of oppositional consciousness, it is particularly dangerous because it appears to be anti-hegemonic. The expression of a movement of the little people against an intangible global form of domination. Anti-Semitism appears to be anti-hegemonic. It is as a fetishized, profoundly reactionary form of anti-capitalism that I would like to begin discussing the recent surge of modern anti-Semitism in the Arab world. And here's a quote from Hannah Arendt on the rise of totalitarian movements and one of the features which she thinks is important about totalitarian movements and what they are and what they do. And I think the key thing that I got from this was the idea that, again, totalitarian movements tend to be much more interested in who you are objectively within some kind of structure that they create, rather than what it is that you do or you say or you think. The introduction, she says, of entirely new methods into political propaganda and indifference to the arguments of political opponents. These movements not only place themselves outside and against the party system as a whole, they found a membership that had never been reached, never been spoiled by the party system. Is this familiar to anybody? Therefore, they did not need to refute opposing arguments and consistently preferred methods which ended in death rather than in persuasion, which spelled terror rather than conviction. They presented disagreements as invariably originating in deep natural social or psychological sources beyond the control of the individual and therefore beyond the power of reason. Now, I'm not saying that the Jeremy Corbyn movement or the Brexit movement or the Trump movement is a totalitarian movement, but I'm saying that there are interesting crossovers and connections and similarities which I think we should take seriously, and I think this may be one of them. I saw this on Facebook some time ago, this picture, proud to be everything the right hates. It's quite interesting because I've got two things to say about this photo. One is that it was a way of kind of constructing the left simply in opposition to the right. And I was thinking the right says it's for human rights, the right says it's against anti-Semitism, the right says it's against terrorism, the right says it's for democracy and the rule of law, the right says it's for science and truth, for parliament, for air support to the Kurds, the right is worried about Chavez, the right is for America. So we have to put across where the right puts its tick, and we're against human rights, we're interested in anti-Semitism, we're defending terrorism and all that stuff. When I look at this now, I'm thinking this is already, in a sense, a little bit out of date, because the right doesn't anymore focus on human rights and the rule of law and science and truth and parliamentary democracy and all of that. It's already shifting and moving, I think. This is a kind of right which was completely in charge 5 years ago, which isn't so much anymore. And there's another interesting thing from this slide, I think, which is that one of the things that we see happening at the moment, I think, or one of the dangers, is that the left is becoming the left is becoming the left that the right always said it was, and the right is becoming the right that the left always said it was. And so I don't know if there's a cliche about the holding the middle, about a kind of holding. Well, it's not necessarily the middle that I'm talking about, but holding a kind of democratic, cosmopolitan politics between these two great big threats. So I want to go through a number of ways of describing the phenomenon of left anti-Semitism. And interestingly, this list is fairly old. I've been kind of talking about it for a while. These slides themselves are quite old. And going through them, what becomes really clear is that a lot of the phenomena that I've been talking about for a long time on the left and in the relationship between left politics, hostility to Israel, and anti-Semitism, is now suddenly, and I'm quite surprised by this, being mirrored on the right. And I'll show you some of what I mean by that. So the first one was contemporary anti-Semitism is difficult to identify. It's not obvious. It's not like something, you know, that you can look at and see without any kind of discussion or controversy. It's difficult to recognise because it frequently appears in a form which resembles, which is linked to legitimate criticism of Israeli policy. This image I thought was very interesting. It's one of the nastiest images I've seen, and I've seen a few, because some people might look at that and say this is kind of criticism of Israel. And other people might look at that and say, hang on, there's no Israel there. There's the Jewish Star of David, and it's killed a child. And is there blood dripping out of the child? So the complexities of understanding the relationship between hostility to Israel and anti-Semitism have always been important. What's happening now, I think, this week, astonishingly, I think, so I've always been concerned about the connection between hostility to Israel and anti-Semitism, and the idea of being against Israel as a kind of signifier of belonging in the community of the left or the good or the progressive or however you want to say it. So for many people, Israel became a signifier. It wasn't ever, you know, the most serious human rights violation on the planet. It wasn't ever the biggest thing on the planet, but it became symbolic of the kind of worldview which I was talking about earlier on, I think. What we're seeing now is that being for Israel is also becoming a signifier on the right. And what worries me, again, with this idea of the kind of, is it the broken middle? I don't think it's the broken middle. I think it's the middle in trouble, is that the notion of being against or for Israel, which operates in that way as a signifier, is a notion which is very binary. So being for Israel as a signifier of belonging on the right can often be actually being for Netanyahu, or being for the settlements, or being, I think I have a quote. No, I don't have a quote. Where's my quote? All right, no quote. But it's in the wrong order. I will come to it. I'm talking about things that happened this week. So, hang on, this was the ZOA's furious attack yesterday on the ADL. So the ADL talked about Steve Bannon as being a threat, a problem. And the ADL responds, one of the ways in which responded was this. Donald Trump's platform on Israel was the strongest pro-Israel platform ever. So whereas we, for a long time, said there's a connection between hostility to Israel and anti-Semitism, now the ZOA is kind of saying, well, if you're not against Israel, if you're pro-Israel, you can't be anti-Semitic. So it's a kind of mainstreaming and an escalation of that idea. Number two, method. So how do we recognize anti-Semitism? And it seems to me that there was always kind of easy shortcuts that people use, kind of rhetorical shortcuts. This was one of them. Israel says it wants to be democratic, and it also wants to be a state for the Jews. This is a contradiction. Therefore, Zionism is racism. Why? Because the idea is that if Israel is democratic and a state for all its people, then it can't be a Jewish state at the same time. Now, it seems to me that methodologically, I mean, I'm a sociologist. We don't start with these kind of not moral, that was a Freudian slip, kind of logic problems. We start with the world. So if we find contradictions within a state, and wow, there are contradictions within many states, in fact, there are contradictions within all states. If we find a contradiction in the state, we look at it and we see how it works, how it's played itself out, how for decades, how successfully or not successfully Israel has fulfilled the function which history gave it to be the state for the Jews, but also to be a democratic state for all of its citizens, how it's done well, how it's done less well, how they have sometimes been in contradiction with each other, and how they've sometimes actually worked rather well together. So in terms of method, one thing that I was worried about was a kind of notion that that we sort of define Israel as being this or that, and we define anti-Semitism as being this or that. But what I would much rather do is look at the actual complex social reality of Israel, and also of movements of solidarity for the Palestinians and of hostility for the Israelis, and to look at them and see what we can actually see. This is Melanie Phillips, who's a fairly right-wing Jewish commentator in the United Kingdom, and she did something similar to what I just described. I just described the kind of logical thing about, Israel can't be Jewish and democratic, therefore it's either going to be racist or democratic. She says this: denying the legal and historical rights of the settlers to the land demonizes and dehumanizes them. That dehumanization of the settlers leads inexorably to the dehumanization of all Jews. And I think she's doing something very similar there. She's defining anyone who disagrees with her own politics as being anti-Semitic. And again, I think we have to look at the complex social reality rather than these sort of definitions. Of course, what that means is that anyone who's for a two-state solution between the Israelis and the Palestinians is defined by Melanie as being anti-Semitic. I mean, it's a little bit of a logical gap, but it's not much of a logical gap. So a kind of mirroring, the right beginning to mirror the left, beginning to use its own methods. 3, it's really important. Anti-Semitic speech and acts are often authored by people who think of themselves as opponents of anti-Semitism. Absolutely standard that the people who, in our time, say anti-Semitic things and support anti-Semitic movements, like Jeremy Corbyn, believe themselves honestly to be opponents of anti-Semitism. Right? They're not people who are kind of hiding, who are, pretending. They have a self-conscious subjectivity of being opponents of anti-Semitism, but they do various things which one may judge, which I would judge, feed into an anti-Semitic worldview. Anti-Semitism, then, is not to be recognised as an internal hatred, or at least not only as that. Anti-Semitism is an objective social phenomenon which cannot be defined simply by reference to the subjective feelings of individuals concerned. This was John Podhoretz yesterday about Steve Bannon, and he said exactly the same thing, actually. He said the key problem with Steve Bannon, Donald Trump's newly named strategist, isn't that he's an anti-Semite. It's not that he's an individual person who's motivated by hatred of Jews. That's not it. The problem is a political problem. The key problem with Steve Bannon is that he, as the CEO of Andrew Breitbart's namesake organisation, he is an aider and abettor of foul extremist views, including anti-Semitic ones. So what we've always said is there's a problem with the Corbynite left connected with anti-Semitism, and people have got really angry and said, how dare you, Jeremy doesn't hate Jews. And now we're getting exactly the same structure of discussion mirrored on the right. There's a problem with Steve Bannon being appointed as one of President-elect Trump's closest advisors, and people say, well, some of Trump's best friends are Jewish and all of that. And the point isn't that he has a personal hatred of Jews, the point is political. We're talking about a political anti-Semitism rather than an anti-Semitism of a kind of personal zoological hatred. Number 4, hostility to Israel tends to mirror and repeat the tropes of older hostilities to Jews, which are usually blood libel or conspiracy theory. There's a blood libel image at the top. I think most people can recognise that as a blood libel image at the top. Some people might say, oh, no, that's criticism of Israel. But I think we could have a whole seminar on that image. I think that's easily recognisable. And the one at the bottom is a mainstream liberal newspaper which gives you a graphical image of the old thing about the Jewish tail wagging the American dog. Did people see Donald Trump's closing argument, the video about so this was some of the... I can play it, actually. Do people want to see it again? Or I'm not sure that we have time. Maybe if we have time later, I'll show it. But the interesting thing about Donald Trump's closing argument was that it was a description of a view of the world which was very, very close to many, many classic anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. It didn't mention Jews. We've already seen, what was it we saw earlier on that didn't mention Jews but was clearly anti-Semitic? I can't remember. But I know from having studied this for 15 years, that anti-Semitism doesn't always mention explicitly Jews. So there's a relationship between Trump's closing argument and anti-Semitism, and we could discuss what it is. We could say, I think it was a dog whistle. You know what a dog whistle is. A dog whistle is a whistle that you blow that people can't hear, that dogs can hear, and they come running. So the political version of dog whistle is you blow the whistle, and anti-Semites can read it and come running, but everybody else can't hear it. If we got time, I'll play the ad again. It's so here's some nice blood libel images, baby killing images, more child killing images. Just criticism of Israel, isn't it? This is an interesting image. Very simple. The food that the Israelis are trying to sell you, are trying to give you to eat, is actually saturated with the blood of Palestinian children. Now, again, it's an interesting question. I don't, for sure, the person who designed that poster or the person who put it up on their wall or on their internet site does not say to themselves, oh, there's a really good way for people to hate Israel, and I can mobilize the blood libel, not like Raad Salah did earlier. But there are these very deeply embedded notions and ways of thinking about Israel and about Jews which become recycled. Mearsheimer and Walt, people may remember. Sorry. 6, the scale of the harms threatened by Israel is often represented as being global or universal. So Israel becomes a signifier for a whole global system, or it becomes the pioneer of surveillance, or it becomes thought of as, or the Palestinians become thought of as the kind of victims, the sort of the signifier, the global victim, and then the Israelis become the global. So it becomes not just a little conflict, a little nasty, protracted conflict on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. It becomes something that's central to everything. And that, of course, also is close to an anti-Semitic tradition which always says that the Jews are central to everything bad in the world. So here's a quiz time for you people. I've blanked out the names. This is how it works. False allegations are made against X and his new head of strategy, X, smearing them as anti-Semites, fascists and racists. Whether through laziness or ideological malice, these smears are recycled uncritically throughout both mainstream and social media. Who are we talking about? This foments a hysterical hatred against the two men, which takes on a life of its own. That same hatred is then channeled against anyone who tries to point out that these allegations are false and these men have been smeared. So are we talking about Jeremy Corbyn and Seamus Milne? Or are we talking about Donald Trump and Steve Bannon? Well, the structure of not... So this isn't a defence against a charge of anti-Semitism. This isn't somebody saying, well, let's look at Steve Bannon's politics, let's look at what he says, what he's done, what kind of political movements he's been involved with. It's not that. It's, how very dare you? And also it's an allegation of bad faith. You're only saying this because you want to discredit Trump, or you want to say that everybody who voted for Trump is a racist, or it's a kind of counter-allegation, and it's precisely the form that we've been seeing for many years in terms of anti-Semitism on the left. This was Ken Livingstone, was the mayor of London, who, when he was accused of anti-Semitism about actually something which had nothing to do with Israel at all, I need to fix that. Ken Livingstone said, "For far too long, the accusation of anti-Semitism has been used against anyone who is critical of the policies of the Israeli government, as I have been." This was 2005, and I noticed it, and I kind of thought, hang on, this is what everybody does. When you raise the issue of anti-Semitism, you can't have a proper discussion about it. You can't discuss, the actual facts, and what you get instead is an angry denial and counter-accusation that the issue of anti-Semitism is raised in bad faith. Anybody recognise that? Anybody happen to you here? Anybody? And here we have graphical representations of the Livingstone Formulation. We have the world trying to protest against Israel's crimes, having its mouth shut with a charge, with a gag of anti-Semitism. Or here the activist having his mouth shut with the gag of anti-Semitism by the United States and Israel together. This is Lattouf. He was a Brazilian anti-Zionist cartoonist who won President Ahmadinejad's Holocaust denial competition in Tehran, but who is also often appears, you'll see it now that I've mentioned it, you'll see Lattouf appears all over hostility to Israel and anti-Zionist websites and boycott websites which think of themselves as anti-racist. So it's a kind of connection. Lots and lots of examples of the Livingstone Formulation. Jenny Tong, I am sick of being accused of anti-Semitism when what I'm doing is criticising Israel and the state of Israel. Jenny Tong the famous thing that Jenny Tong did was to say, I think the Israel lobby has its grips on the Western world, its financial grips. So she was using Mearsheimer and Walt's apparently anti-racist formulation to do conspiracy theory. And then you call her on it and she says, oh, you only accuse me of this because you want to silence my criticism of Israel. David Duke, the same. Oh, that's a lovely quote, which I don't have time for. So this is the structure. And this structure is coming back, and it's coming back into the mainstream. Person A. Because Mr. Trump's campaign, or the Brexit campaign, was xenophobic, racist, and it mirrored anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, and because there were key elements to the campaign, and because these were key elements to the campaign, I'm worried about the racism which is indicated by the victory, and or which may flow from the victory. That's person A. And the response that we're seeing more and more from person B is to respond incandescent with rage. How dare you say that the American or the British electorate is racist? The American or the British electorate is good. You're just saying that the Americans or the Brits are racist in order to silence their legitimate concerns about jobs, housing, social security, and healthcare. So the response to the raising of the issue of xenophobia as it relates to Trump or as it relates to Brexit is this old Livingstone Formulation response, which says, how dare you? How dare you? How dare you? Because all you're trying to do is to silence the, or to smear Corbyn, Trump, or Brexit, Nigel Farage. So that's the structure which we're seeing appear. I'm going on a long time, I think. I need a little more time if people are not sleeping yet. Okay. Let me just jump ahead a little then. Missing some nice stuff. Hang on, where's number one? There we go. So, some common threads between Brexit and Trump that I've been thinking about. I'm also thinking about the Corbyn movement. So, I think the right word for these movements is populist. It's the rise of populism. And what does populism mean? Well, I'm not entirely sure, but I think that on the one hand you have a kind of populist movement. So with Brexit, everything was about the view of the British people on one particular day. That became democracy. The will of the people on one day became democracy, and everything else, the institutions, the European institutions, Parliament, democratic culture, equality, a certain cosmopolitan way of dealing with foreigners, all became something that wasn't the will of the people. And I think simply that's what I'm thinking about in the terms of the rise of populism, as distinct from a kind of democratic tradition of politics and of culture. So, common threads between Brexit and Trump. Number one, a focus on immigration and foreigners as a key problem. Brexit was very simple. The two key claims of the Brexit campaign were that one of the problems was foreigners over here in Britain taking our jobs, Romanians and Poles. The other key problem was foreigners over there in Brussels telling us what to do. Number two, a refusal to consider the racism which comes along with this focus on immigration and foreigner blaming. Instead of a rational consideration, there is an angry counter-accusation of bad faith. The Corbyn left doesn't blame foreigners, but it does have a soft spot for people who find that Israel is at the centre of the universe, and it has a similar kind of I'm looking for a word which I've lost, a similar anger with people who raise the issue of anti-Semitism. So the idea is that racism becomes the cry of the oppressed. The anti-Semitism of people who vote for Hamas, or the xenophobia of people who embrace Brexit or Trump, becomes the cry of the oppressed. And then anti-racism, the opposition to racism, becomes a kind of power discourse of what is then called the cosmopolitan elite. Anti-racism becomes a power discourse to be mobilised against the oppressed. This is not my view, yes? This is a view which I find quite interesting. I think it's popping up all over the place, and I think it's a worry. So two, a refusal. We've just done that one, haven't we? Three, a resentment toward and a contempt for democratic politics. So what I just said really was the counterposition to, on the one hand, the will of the people as represented by the leader.
The good people.
The will of the, yes, the will of the good people. Number four, a contempt for civil servants, for experts, for scientists, for economists. All are subordinated to the people. Michael Gove, one of the leaders of the Brexit campaign, famously said that somebody said to him, look, breaking up the single market would cost a lot of jobs and a lot of money. It would decrease trade. You know, all the economists agree. And Gove said, well, we've had enough of experts, haven't we? And then he said, in Nazi Germany, Einstein was right about relativity, but the government got together 100 scientists to say that Einstein's theory of relativity was wrong, and they forced them to do it. And of course, Einstein responded, if I was wrong, they'd only have needed one, which was a nice response. But now Michael Gove is portraying himself as Einstein, and all of the economists and civil servants and people who, you know a thing or two about trade as like the Nazi scientists who were bought off. Somebody else, Nigel Lawson, called the economists, he said that they had prostituted themselves. I'm a bit sensitive about this because my wife was one of them. So there you go. Here we have the people, the enemies of the people. So there was a court case, not a big court case really, about whether Parliament would have to make a decision to leave the European Union or whether the government could do it. And the judges made a decision that the spokespeople for the people didn't like. And this was the headline in one of the big mainstream newspapers, Enemies of the People. So again, this construction of people who are good people and not good people, and this counterposition of the will of the people to democratic norms such as the rule of law. 5, contempt for what is characterised pejoratively as political correctness. The concerns of the cosmopolitan elite. Now, we could again have a whole lecture about political correctness and identity politics. And for sure, sometimes it appears in a form which is kind of contemptible. I think that's right. But, babies and bathwater, really. A post-truth politics. See, the bus. This was the campaign bus of the Brexit campaign. On the side of the bus it said, we send the EU £350 million a week. Let's fund our NHS, our National Health Service instead. Vote leave. Vote leave the EU. And the very moment the result came in, people said, OK, where's our £350 million? And they said, well, it's not coming. Immediately, Nigel Farage, one of the leaders of the Brexit campaign, immediately said, no, well, we didn't really mean that. I mean, it was, there you go. There are huge legitimate concerns with the status quo. Housing, poverty, inequality, unemployment, health services. There are concerns. I have concerns. But the claim that either Trump or Brexit addresses those concerns is fundamentally dishonest, I suspect. The idea that to smash up the institutions of the European Union will bring in more money. By the way, in Britain, the ministries are full of experts and economists and lawyers now who are trying to negotiate a Brexit. So it was always said that the EU is full of bureaucrats that we pay money and we don't get anything for. The bureaucrats have been having a great time. The lawyers, the economists, the ministries can't get enough of these people. And by the way, also this is I'm talking about my wife again, but the Commission is trying to recruit people who know about trade and Britain and the relationship between Britain and Europe as well as Britain. Sorry, the Commission and Britain are both trying to recruit these cohorts of experts. Isolationism, particularly a contempt for the very notion of humanitarian intervention. That when people are in danger of genocide, we should take that seriously. As if there's the kind of end of that notion of humanity. With all the problems that we've seen over the last 20 years in trying to realise that notion of humanity, but a kind of contempt for it. Although, of course, bomb ISIS is the plan, isn't it? But consistency isn't always there. Hostility to free trade agreements, protectionism and high tariffs. Again, a kind of populist demand. We're going to bring your jobs back from China. We're going to bring your jobs back from Europe. We're going to get rid of the Romanians. But no sort of real conception of how that's possibly going to work. Underlying both Trump and Brexit is a fear of Muslim immigration in particular. Both of these movements played on Islamophobic fears. Again, this is not to say that everybody who voted for Trump is Islamophobic or hates Muslims. But clearly, the campaigns, both of the campaigns, raised this as a fear and as an issue. And again, it was a destruction of a kind of it was like either you're for Muslims or you're against Muslims. It was nothing about the distinction between Islamist politics and Muslims and how a democratic society deals with that. It became, you're for Muslims, you're against Muslims. And 10, the rhetoric, taking our country back, making America great again, is absolutely interchangeable. Now, of course, I'm not saying these are identical, and I'm not saying that it's exactly the same, but I think there are some really significant similarities between these two movements. I also think that the kind of rise of populism on the left. So one of the hopes of the left is that if only Bernie had been the candidate, then he would have beaten Trump, because Bernie raises the same issues, but he has better answers. And it seems to me that, well, sort of empirically, I just think there's no reason to think that's true at all. Some old Jewish guy from Brooklyn, I can't see that he wouldn't have been completely eviscerated by the Trump campaign. But I think there's something more than that. There's a kind of left fantasy that we could ride the tiger. That there's a thrill, there's an excitement about this power which we're seeing, which is being kind of interpreted as a democratic revolt, or not a democratic revolt, but a revolt against politics, against the neoliberalism, against whatever you like. And there's a thrill on the left that if only we could ride it, if only we could lead it. So what's presented as a kind of a sort of really democratic notion that we should listen to the issues that people really have becomes also a kind of patronizing notion that, well, people said they wanted Trump, they wanted to build the wall, they wanted to get rid of illegal immigrants. That's what they said they wanted. But no, we know better what they really wanted, and we're going to interpret what they really wanted as, you know, a more radical program for healthcare and for jobs and for all of that stuff. So there's this, again, this problem with interpretation. I think we have enough. And that finally, yes, this idea that both Trump and Brexit propagate a notion that the status quo is completely unbearable, that things have never been worse, and that things could not be worse. And it seems to me that anyone who knows anything about the totalitarianism that these movements in some ways resemble knows that things could be worse, and they could be much, much worse. I mean, I could say more about that, but I think you get the point. So thank you very much, people.